Somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, the human body quietly turns against itself. Your core temperature drops to its lowest point of the entire day, your heart slows, your defenses thin, and your grip on warmth loosens without you ever waking to notice it. And in the frozen north, that hour arrived at the exact moment the fire had burned down to its faintest breath. Two things falling at once: the flame and the body. This is why, for thousands of years, the cold did not take people at random. Winter had a favorite hour, and it was not soldiers who faced it, not trained survival experts with modern gear, but ordinary people. A child sleeping too far from the embers, an elder whose body no longer held heat the way it once did, a mother lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind test the walls. Because winter was never simply a season. It was a system of pressure, a force that reshaped every hour of human life across Europe, Siberia, Greenland, and North America. Food vanished beneath the ice, rivers hardened into walls, and daylight shrank until entire communities lived by firelight alone. And yet, here is what almost no one expects. Some of the shelters these people built held their heat so well that they outperformed poorly insulated cabins standing today. No engines, no electricity, no blueprints. Only bark, timber, earth, and a knowledge earned the hardest way possible. Because the cold itself was never the true enemy. Cold does not kill all at once. It dismantles a life one system at a time, until a weak fire becomes exhaustion. Exhaustion becomes a mistake, and a mistake becomes the last one a person ever makes. The real battle was never human against winter. It was human against collapse. But when archaeologists dig into the floors of these ancient homes, they keep uncovering something strange. Evidence that in that deadliest hour, when the temperature bottomed out and every reasonable person was asleep, someone in that house was still awake. Someone was moving in the dark. The question is who and why. To answer that, you have to understand how these people speak to us now, because they left behind no letters, no records, no names. They left the floor, and the floor remembers everything. A layer of charcoal pressed deep into the earth, thick and unbroken, tells us that a fire burned in that spot not for a night, but for an entire season, tended without pause. A ceiling stained black with soot tells us how the smoke moved and how long people lived beneath it. Post holes dug in the same place 2, 3, 4 times over tell us that a roof once gave way under the snow and that the survivors went out into the cold and built it again. The house itself is the witness, and what it testifies to is a war fought in silence. Because in the deep north, the cold almost never killed with violence. It began with numb fingers, then reactions that slowed without the person noticing. Then a strange, soft confusion that blurred the difference between good judgment and bad. And finally a sleep so warm and so convincing that no one ever woke from it. The floor tells us why the flimsy shelters failed too, because the failure was never a single, dramatic collapse. It was arithmetic. Thin walls bled warmth into the freezing air, and every degree lost demanded another armful of wood, and every armful of wood had to be found, cut, and hauled back through snow that swallowed a person to the knee. Each trip burned calories that winter had already made nearly impossible to replace. The body slipped into a deficit it could not climb out of, and a weakening body works slower. And slow work in the heart of winter is how entire families quietly disappeared. So they solved it in a way that feels almost strange to us now. They stopped trying to heat a building and started heating each other. pressed together inside those sealed winter homes, generation beside generation. Each resting adult gave off roughly the warmth of a small heater, and a dozen bodies in one low, tight room could lift the temperature without burning a single extra log. Fewer walls exposed to the night. One fire instead of many. Labor shared. Knowledge shared. Risk shared. But the floor holds one more mark, faint and easy to miss. A stain that fire could never have left behind. A stain of water. Water inside a winter home was a slower and far more patient killer than the cold outside it. It came from everywhere, and it never announced itself. Every breath released it into the air. Every boot carried it in from the snow. Every pot set over the flames lifted it up in a cloud, and every block of melting ice let it seep quietly into the ground. And once that dampness settled into a sealed room, it went to work destroying the one thing standing between a body and death: insulation. A wet fur stops holding warmth. A damp hide pulls the heat straight out of the skin it was meant to protect. Wood rots, roofs weaken, and a family can slowly freeze inside a house that is still standing. Which is why the shelters of the North could not simply be built. They had to be alive. They had to breathe. And that is exactly what these people made. The smoke hole in the roof was a lung, opened wider when the air grew thick and heavy, narrowed to a slit when the wind turned hostile, inhaling and exhaling with the weather itself. The hides hung along the inner walls were skin, flexing against the drafts that hunted for a way in. The moss packed into every seam was made of pores, drinking the moisture out of the air and sealing the gaps at the same time. The sleeping platforms, raised above the floor, lifted the body clear of the dead zone where the cold and the wet always pooled, because in that room, height was life. And the bent frame of saplings holding all of it together was a skeleton, patient and flexible, carrying the weight of the world above them. But every living body needs a heart, and the fire was theirs. It was never only warmth. It was order. It decided when to cook, when to mend, when to sleep, and when to speak. When the flames ran strong, life moved with purpose, and when they faded, everything faded with them. The shadows swelled, the walls grew colder, and breath began to hang visible in the air inside their own home. So they learned never to let a fire simply burn. They mastered the slow burn instead. Hardwood embers banked beneath a blanket of ash, glowing patiently through the darkness so the morning fire could be raised from living coals rather than built from nothing. A heart is not allowed to stop. Not once. Not for a single night. And yet, even a living body can be crushed by something that falls without a sound from the sky. Snow falls without weight, or so it seems. But wet snow, gathering hour after hour across a roof through a long storm, can build into a load of hundreds of pounds, silent and growing, pressing down on a family that has no idea it is happening because they are asleep beneath it. And so the flat roof, the simplest and most obvious shape a human being can build, turned out to be a quiet death trap. It held the snow like a shelf until the beams gave way all at once. What replaced it was the curve. They bent young saplings while the wood was still green and willing, shaping arches that flexed under a burden instead of snapping beneath it, roofs that carried the crushing weight downward and outward into the earth, instead of letting it collect at a single breaking point. And the curve gave them something else they may not have understood, but certainly felt, because when the storms came howling across open ground, the wind slid around a rounded shelter, rather than slamming into a flat wall. And a house that the wind cannot grip is a house that does not leak its heat away. Then came the strangest reversal of all. The same snow that could crush a home was packed deliberately against its outer walls, because inside that snow were countless pockets of trapped air, and trapped air is one of the finest insulators nature ever made. The killer became the blanket. But here is what we get wrong when we tell this story. We call it invention, as though someone sat down and cleverly figured it out. It was not invention. It was selection. Every winter was an experiment with immediate and absolute consequences, and a bad design was never simply corrected. It disappeared, along with the family that trusted it. The homes we uncover today are not the best ideas the ancient North ever produced. They are the ideas that survived. Northern architecture was never truly designed. It was chosen over thousands of winters, and the price of every lesson was paid in human lives. Which is why the same answers appear again and again in places that never met. The turf houses of Scandinavia, the snow shelters of the Inuit, the sunken pit dwellings of Siberia. Different peoples, different centuries, identical conclusions. Physics does not care about culture. It only rewards adaptation. And yet, for all of this, the deadliest failure of a winter was never the one that happened to the roof. It was the one that happened inside the human mind. Because a mind can freeze too. Months sealed inside one dim room while the storms erased the world outside, while the darkness stretched far longer than the light, could unravel a person as surely as the frost could. So they built shelter for the mind as carefully as they built it for the body. Routine became medicine. The same tasks in the same order, day after day, giving shape to hours that would otherwise dissolve into a gray and endless sameness. The stories told beside the fire were never idle entertainment. They were storage. They held memory, identity, and the hard lessons of everyone who had already survived a winter like this one, so that nothing died with the elder who carried it. And the children learned not from instruction, but from watching. How to tend an ember, how to read the color of smoke, how to hear a change in the wind through the walls, until survival lived in their hands before they could explain it. And still, all of it hung by a thread. One unwatched ember against a dry bark wall, one beam giving way beneath the snow. Everything gone in minutes. Which brings us back to the floor, and to the question we started with. Because when archaeologists examine those ancient hearths, they often find ash beds that are deep and even and disturbed, banked, raked, and rebuilt more than once in a single night. And that detail says something no one ever wrote down. A fire does not survive a night on its own. Someone has to keep it. Which means that in that deadliest hour, when every body in the house had cooled and every reasonable person was asleep, someone was rising in the dark, feeling for the ash, coaxing the coals back to life, and lying down again without a word. We cannot know their names, but we can guess who it often was. The old, the ones who slept the least, the ones who would freeze first if the fire failed, the ones who had the fewest years left to lose, choosing night after night to spend them keeping everyone else warm. And when spring finally came and the shelters emptied, the buildings were left behind, but the knowledge never was. Every rebuilt roof, every better entrance, every raised platform was a lesson written directly into the architecture. We like to say civilization began with agriculture or writing or cities. Maybe it began much earlier than that. On the first night, one human being chose to stay awake so that another could sleep. Everything we have was built on top of those unrecorded hours. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, the forgotten engineering and the quiet courage of the ancient world, then subscribe and stay with us. Because history here is not a myth. It is the story of how human beings refused to disappear.